This is Evan Blake with the World Socialist website. I'm joined by WSWS writer Tim Rivers. Today we're interviewing Tammy and Ed for the Global Workers Inquest into the COVID-19 pandemic. Tammy and Ed are two retired workers from Flint, Michigan, who have suffered from long COVID for the past 2 years.
Thanks, Evan. Welcome, Tammy and Ed. I'm really glad that you were able to make it.
Yep. Thank you for having us.
Ed, you worked at Chrysler Jefferson Assembly in Detroit. Is that right?
Jefferson North, yes.
Jefferson North. When did you hire in down there?
That was 1998 in August.
Mm-hmm.
I had worked previously as a broadcast engineer and a DJ for about 20 years before that industry started collapsing, and then I ended up working on the line at Chrysler, and that was a rough place to work, I'll tell you.
Tell us about it.
Well, the jobs, you had 48 seconds to do your job, and there was 52 seconds worth of elements that you had to do in them 48 seconds. And so you were constantly running full bore. I had numerous repetitive stress injuries.
Like for example, carpal tunnel. What type of?
Well, yeah, trigger finger actually more commonly than the carpal tunnel, but I probably do have that too.
What's trigger finger?
That's
what
where you wake up in the morning and your hands just like a fist, and you have to like literally pull it to open, and then instead of having a smooth motion like this, you have like open, closed, and there was no in between there. The tendons would get so jacked up in your hands it just wouldn't work right. The jobs were anything but ergonomic, and they were pretty hard on your body. I had numerous stress fractures in my ribs while I was there, from where you have to work a car when it's up 3 or 4 foot in the air, and you're working like way up under the dashboard, and the carrier that holds the cars banging into you. And so, yeah, I've had numerous stress fractures in my ribs. I had a heart attack, what they call a silent heart attack. I had no chest pain, but I felt almost like I had the flu, and everything was blurry when I was looking through a bowl of water, and went down. They made me walk all the way to medical across the plant. I got down there and they hooked me up to the monitor and said, "You're going to the hospital." So I spent the next 10 days in the hospital and had a 5-way bypass.
That happened when you were at work, when you were on the line.
Yes. I was 39 years old when that happened.
What happened after that? Did you take time off? You go back to work?
Well, I was out on medical for about 6 months, and then I spent another 7 years in there. Places like that used to have halfway decent benefits and stuff, but really it's designed to take you in, work you to death, and spit you out. There is such little regard for the workers, it's not funny.
Tell us about your symptoms in long COVID. What's that like?
Horrible. The worst thing has been the fatigue. It's so hard. I feel like I have 500 pounds strapped to me somewhere.
All the time?
All the time. Almost, yep. I hardly ever get a break from it. I did get a spell after my second Moderna jab where I felt better for probably about 6-8 weeks. And then I suspect I might have caught Delta at that time. That was in 2021. late summer sometime, early fall. And since then, it's like you take 6 dice with symptoms on them and throw them, and that's what you get this day, you know. The one recurring thing I can say is my appetite's hardly anything anymore. And the fatigue.
You follow the news pretty closely, Ed,
Yeah,
and the Biden administration is claiming that the pandemic is over and everybody should get back to normal.
no, there's no normal. First of all, the pandemic's long from over. I knew we were going to have a hard time with this pandemic, but I never imagined the whole anti-mask, anti-vaccine fiasco and people just downright calling it a hoax or denying it. Once COVID erupted in the United States, the corporations were just going crazy because, you know, losing profits. And, you know, again, corporations don't care about people, they care about money. And it's really, people got to understand that, you know, the world around us is probably not real happy with how this pandemic's unfolded in America because it reaches out to everywhere else.
Yeah, let me ask you a question about that, because at the beginning of 2020, I know you remember this, Trump said that nobody knew or could have known that this was a complete surprise. And since that time, we learned that US government was in close communication with China. They knew very well how the virus spreads through the air, and they did nothing to warn the public about it.
Yeah, we should have locked down and locked down hard. And what we had was more of a symbolic lockdown, if I'd call a term to it. And it was woefully inadequate.
We've characterized the Biden administration's response as basically a vaccine only approach, that they basically saw the vaccine as, you know, sort of a magic bullet that would, you know, in the pandemic. And I think the fundamental issue, you know, as you said, they refused to lock down. And, you know, why was that? It was because, you know, the Democrats are, you know, beholden to Wall Street. Their number one priority was to reopen the schools in the, you know, a year ago, you know, in spring 2021. So maybe do you want to comment a bit more on that? And we could also hear what Tammy thinks about those issues.
I think it was a mistake to open the schools back up. I think it was a mistake to open anything really, where, you know, theaters and concerts and, you know, large volumes of people. I think that should have stayed closed longer. I think virtual schooling would be a good alternative, but really it was building from the ground up, and there were so many bugs to work out in it, you know, even things like, do all the students have internet access, you know?
What do you think about the economic issues? You know, the fact that why do they refuse lockdowns? You know, it's because it would stop the flow of profits. You know, they've got to open the schools to send the parents back to work.
Right. Well, profits shouldn't have been the issue, but it always is. And until that changes, we're not going to change a lot of problems that are very dire towards our world. Let me get you Tammy, and you can ask her that.
Okay, thanks, Ed.
Let me ask you a question about actually both parties. In a recent perspective, the World Socialist website published about the surge in the BA2 Omicron subvariant. We wrote, quote, "The very evolution of Omicron, its BA1 and BA2 subvariants, is the product of the capitalist response to the pandemic, which has subordinated public health to the profit interests of the ruling elite. By refusing to implement the measures necessary to contain and ultimately eliminate the virus in each country, the ruling class has spawned Frankenstein's monsters, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and now Omicron, with each one worse than the predecessor. This week, Congress, and this is both parties, they don't disagree about this, they axed all additional funding for the pandemic, which means that the testing capacity will decline later this month. Funding to test and treat people who are uninsured will completely dry up in April. And by May, the federal supply of monoclonal antibodies will run out. Preventative treatments for immunocompromised people, such as yourselves, will only last until July, and the federal stockpile of antiviral pills, such as Pfizer's Paxlovid, which is highly effective at reducing hospitalizations, will be empty by September or earlier. The Biden administration will now be unable to purchase further vaccine doses if a fourth shot is deemed necessary due to waning immunity. And by early summer, there will be no longer funding for federal studies on new coronavirus variants, treatments, such as antivirals and other measures to prepare for future surges. Would you share with us and our listeners your thoughts on some of these issues and the current situation on the pandemic in the States?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that they're making a big mistake. They're setting us up for a huge disaster because it's been known that this thing is mutating, has mutated, and viruses do mutate, and they can get deadlier and more infectious as they mutate, which in turn can mean more loss of lives, which means if they're both agreeing on this, they don't give a damn about any of us.
I think that's true.
The party situation, I really think that there needs to be more emphasis on another party. A two-party system really doesn't work all that well. And I'm really scared for what's coming, as far as the future.
I wanted to ask you about another issue that's affected you, and that's the question of food stamps and how it's tied to pandemic funding. You mentioned recently that you currently receive food stamps, but they're threatened to be cut off if the CDC finds that COVID is no longer an issue in Michigan. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah. You normally just get $20 a month. And then we receive the extra to bring us up to the maximum for a household of 2. And so that brings us up to $4.59. And I guess it goes by case numbers. So as long as the case numbers are at a certain level, then they approve the extra food stamps for the pandemic. But when they say that those are going to stop, then our food stamps would just go back down to $20, no matter the cost of food, mind you, which is extremely high. So
what's that going to mean if they cut it off?
It's going to be tough for us, to make it,
It's rough on the 450.
Yeah, it's rough just with the $4.59, we end up having to use extra money every month, even with that, towards food, So it'll be tight.
The whole economic system is just controlled by, a tiny oligarchy. And it's only gotten worse during the pandemic. Just from the start of the pandemic through last October, the wealth of the billionaires in the US increased by $2.1 trillion, or 70%, while tens of millions of working people have faced unemployment, illness, and just the social conditions have gotten worse and worse.
Let's talk about Flint. In August of 2020, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, Joe Kishore, was at that time the candidate for president. He wrote a statement on the $600 million settlement in the Flint water crisis. I want to cite a couple of points that he made and get your thoughts on it. He wrote, quote, "The losses suffered by Flint residents are incalculable. Dozens, if not hundreds, of preventable deaths, countless miscarriages, immense loss of income, plummeting home values, and lifelong illnesses for adults and particularly children, whose rapid growth development can be more severely impacted by neurological, emotional damage produced by lead poisoning." Democratic Governor Whitmer and the corporate media have called the preliminary settlement, which is expected to receive court approval in 45 to 60 days, quote, "historic," and have declared that it is bringing closure to the residents of the city. Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel said it is, quote, "a step in the healing process for Flint," close quote. And then Kishore answered, "It is nothing of the sort. Flint is a microcosm of a society ruled by complete indifference and hostility to the well-being of the majority, the working class. The method applied to the Flint water is now being applied in coronavirus pandemic. The Trump administration, Michigan Republicans, and the Democratic Party are not concerned about saving lives or the well-being of the population, but in protecting corporate profit."
Mhm.
I think you'd agree.
Mhm.
He contrasted the CARES Act, which had gone through a couple of months earlier. He said, "By late March, in what can be called the Great Wall Street Heist of 2020, the Congress of Millionaires passed the CARES Act with a nearly unanimous vote. The bill gave hundreds of billions of dollars to corporations and sanctioned the multi-trillion-dollar bailout of Wall Street by the Federal Reserve. The bailout was many thousands of times greater than the $600 million settlement for Flint. Unlike Flint residents who will have to provide evidence-based proof of lead levels from 6 years ago, the corporations got their money with no strings attached, no need to prove justification for compensation. And while the super rich did not have to wait for their money, the people of Flint will surely wait months, if not years, as demonstrated from lawsuits surrounding Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, the BP oil spill, wildfires in California, Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and on and on." How do you feel about it?
I'd say that's right. People always have to wait
Mhm.
if they get it at all. It's not just Flint that's been affected by, the lead water. It's in a lot of places,
Absolutely.
because the infrastructure is bad in a lot of places.
Right.
It needs to be taken care of everywhere.
Absolutely.
It can happen anywhere. And all these things need to be addressed, not after it happens, but before it happens.
Yeah, the Great Wall Street Heist is a good way to put that. It's like, they got all these billions. We got a couple little $1,200 checks to shut us up, and that's about it. It really needs to change. I think capitalism in the United States is in its very last throes. And what I see it as is these people are trying to just vacuum in as much as they can before the bottom drops out. And the fact that money is so much greater a priority than the people that's creating that money to begin with is pretty sad. It really is.
I just wanted to cite in our perspective on the BA2 subvariant, which is now spreading around the world. It's causing a major surge of cases globally. We wrote, quote, the most critical task is to build a unified mass movement of the international working class to stop the drive to World War III and to initiate a global war against COVID-19, end quote. And I think, if you look at the budget, Tim referenced it earlier, but they cut all COVID funding from this $1.5 trillion budget. And they approved a record military budget for $800 billion. A lot of workers that we've spoken with have said, that these resources should be going to fight the pandemic, that we shouldn't be, ratcheting up the threat of war with Russia, and, really, which could quickly escalate into nuclear war. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on these issues and sort of the need to fight the pandemic and to stop the drive to war.
I've never been one for the whole herd immunity idea because variants and the severeness of the disease, as well as long COVID. Those are all issues that, I don't know, some people just don't seem to put two and two together. And yes, they should be fighting this pandemic with everything they've got. And instead, what's happening is they're just making the rich that much richer while the rest of us get ran over by the dozer, And the only socialism we really have to speak of in this country anymore is all the subsidization of these corporations, and they don't even pay taxes. And that's about as broken as you can get in a system, in my opinion. And even before the pandemic, average people were struggling very bad, and now they're struggling even worse if they're not already dead. And that's not right. That's just inhumane to me, that all they care about is profit, profit, profit.
The development of the war is very closely connected to the global rise in food prices and inflation, which were surging before the war, but now they're massively, food is skyrocketing.
Yeah.
It's going to intensify. You want to go into it a little further?
Well, a lot of the inflation is because all that money for pandemic relief went to those who didn't need it anyways. And really, it really skewed the whole system.
And now there's so many more people needing.
Right, and now, everybody is hanging by a thread except for the ultra rich elites. If I had $1 million, $1 million, I could live, her and I could live the best life we could live till we die and probably not need anything. So when you figure people that are reporting portfolios of $64 billion and it's not enough for them, well, that's addiction is what that is. That's addiction to greed on a sociopathic level.
I wanted to go back to the issue of long COVID just for a bit. Hannah Davis, who's a prominent advocate on long COVID, wrote a thread on Twitter on Thursday, sort of summing up the current situation, what we've been talking about, the fact that they've lifted all mitigations and just are, letting the virus rip. So I wanted to read a bit of what she she wrote, and sort of hear your thoughts on it. She said, quote, "The US has chosen to prioritize the economy despite strong, countless studies that COVID harms many people, even those without long COVID or hospitalization. COVID predominantly affects the vascular system, the blood vessels, causing harm to the blood cells and blood flow. This has a downstream impact on nerves, immune system, and multiple organs, including the brain. Vaccination prevents against death, but not against long-term damage. Even having non-hospitalized COVID increases the risk of 18 severe vascular conditions, including strokes, heart failure, clots, embolisms. COVID can cause severe cognitive issues and brain changes in people who had never been hospitalized. There's no evidence that this resolves over time. Many have had this for 2 years. There is no real evidence that COVID will evolve to become less dangerous over time, but there is evidence to suggest it will become more dangerous, especially given the amount of spread and ability to create new variants." This part I think is really important. She says, "Behind the scenes, all of this is acknowledged. Researchers, including at the National Institutes of Health, have acknowledged a likely wave of early onset dementia. The WHO and CDC meet with patients regularly and acknowledge the severity and future consequences, but there's no public awareness that just having COVID in itself is a huge health risk for your future, even from a quote unquote mild infection, even if you feel recovered. For those of us who are up to date on COVID impacts, including breakthroughs and reinfections, it genuinely looks like we are going to kill or disable an enormous percent of our population in the next 10 years, and our leaders have decided to intentionally keep people in the dark," end quote. So I guess I was wondering if you could speak on this and your thoughts on the fact that the CDC, the WHO, the NIH, and the federal and state governments have known about the massive impact of long COVID and the societal impacts this will have, but they've decided to let the virus spread, to encourage people to take off their masks and basically end all mitigation measures.
Well, first, the whole brain fog thing, that is the most understating name they could have possibly given that. I'd explain it as my brain went from being 59 years old to being 8. Trying to stay on task is almost impossible. And I mean, I couldn't count how many times a day I'm standing somewhere saying, why was I in this room? It's early onset dementia is what it is. And it's horrifying. It really is horrifying. And to call it something so innocent as brain fog is ludicrous.
I have grandkids and they're all in the same household, and some can be vaxxed and some still can't, and again, there are the anti-vaxxers, but when we were growing up and we went to school, I remember, we had to go to school, we had to have shots in order to go to school. I do not remember ever being such a fuss to have a vaccine to go to school. I don't understand why, there's such a distrust.
Yeah, I think it's a really critical issue. It's something we're going to be, really digging into for the inquest. There's all sorts of, dark money. The Koch brothers, sort of the Koch network has been a major financier for these misinformation campaigns, and it's just, it's ubiquitous. It's on social media, it's hard to avoid. If you're in, if you already sort of are in some of those networks, you're going to be fed, this total, lies and propaganda about the vaccines, about everything about the pandemic. So what would you tell, other workers why they should participate in the inquest, and why it's important to, share their experiences during the pandemic and really, learn from these, what's happened?
If you don't, we're not going to be here, especially if you have kids. It's not only for our lives, but if we don't do things right now, your kids and grandkids, they're not going to have a place to live. You know,
Yeah.
we got to figure it out before it's too late. So things are already getting worse as far as like, the wildfires. I mean, I was just thinking too, like, it's wintertime, and I was telling Eddie the other day that I have not ever in a time remembered hearing about so many tornadoes going on in the wintertime. And even like this last one being an EF4, I mean, that's just horrific in the wintertime. It's not even tornado season.
Yeah. No, that's a major, I mean, the question of climate change is a huge issue, and the way it's connected to future pandemics as well,
Yeah,
it's
it all is intertwined,
Yeah.
because we're getting closer and closer into these animals' environment, and that is how a lot of these things begin.
Thank you so much, Tammy and Ed, for participating in the inquest. And everyone watching today, I'd encourage you to fill out the form below the video, take part, share your testimony, share your experiences, and really use this to educate the working class and really prepare to build a movement that can actually put an end to the pandemic, because we can't keep going on with this. We can't accept unending mass death, mass infections, and mass cases of long COVID. So thank you again, Tammy and Ed.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.